how many are watching this live and how many are watching it on YouTube or at all, but it gives me an opportunity to explore some of the ideas from this new book on Charles Sanders Peirce's relevance for modern linguistic theory that I'm working on for Oxford University Press, as well as a biography I'm doing of Peirce. But the course, of course, as we see in the syllabus, covers a lot more information than simply Peirce. But today, we're going to give just a broad overview of signs. This may be familiar to a great many of you, but when we talk about signs or semiotics or semiology, there are various different approaches. This is something that's been looked at for a long time, and my particular approach and the remainder of the course and the lectures that we have yet to go is decidedly Peircean, and so I want to talk about Peirce's view of signs. To start, we can ask the question, why are signs important? So to give a couple of quotes from Peirce, the most fundamental problem of logic is to form a definition of a sign. For all logical operations can be conducted in signs. So Peirce considered himself throughout his life to be primarily a logician. He read his first book on logic, Whately's book on logic, when he was 12 years old. His older brother, was a mathematician, taught math at Harvard, and became a dean of mathematics at Harvard. And he introduced Peirce to logic, and Peirce's father, who was then considered the greatest mathematician in the United States, an astronomer, and was a professor at Harvard for 50 years, also helped Peirce learn a lot of logic. And so for his entire career, even though his only degree was in chemistry, Peirce considered himself primarily a logician. The only book Charles Sanders Peirce ever published was in astronomy, and it's pretty much just the mathematics of astronomy, studying the properties of light based on his own experiments. But Peirce grew up on the Harvard campus. Anybody who knows the Harvard campus will have seen Seaver Hall, which was built by a former classmate of Peirce's, and Peirce graduated from Harvard in 1859, but he actually grew up on the Harvard grounds. The site of Seaver Hall used to be the Peirce home, which was built for the Peirce family by Harvard, since his father was such an important professor there. Peirce goes on to say that by a person, I suppose we mean an animal that has command of some syntactical language. I actually don't think that's right anymore, especially if you read my book, How Language Began. I think that syntax is found outside of our species. In fact, it's found in chemistry and DNA and all sorts of things. But when Peirce talks about syntax or syntactical language, he's really talking about a language that has a way of arranging and manipulating signs. To say that Peirce was a logician perhaps underestimates his contributions a bit, because after all, he was the inventor of modern logic. He and Frege, working on separate continents, came up with the ideas behind first and second order logic roughly the same time, although Peirce's notation was, after it was slightly modified by Peano, became the basis of most logic, and Frege's notational system was largely ignored. In Principia Mathematica by Russell and Whitehead, for example, they used Peirce's system, although they never give Peirce really the credit for that, but they used Peirce's system. So Peirce was a founder of logic, and one of the differences, some of the most significant differences between Peirce and Frege, is that Frege developed an axiomatic logic. He had a series of axioms from which he derived his principles. Peirce, on the other hand, developed something called existential graphs, which, as we will see in coming lectures, is roughly identical to what was discovered 80 years later by Hans Kampf, discourse representation theory. And Peirce's version of existential graphs is actually, as Hilary Putnam says, a proof procedure for first order logic. And a lot of that applies to second order logic, which of course neither can be proven. That's not what a proof procedure is. Person goes on to say the individual man, since his separate existence is manifested only by ignorance and error, so far as he is anything apart from his fellows, and from what he and they are to be, is only a negation. So, in that sense, Peirce is saying that humans are a sign of negation, where each one of us is a sign of what we're not. What so you sort of subtract what we're not. Pike actually talked about this when he talked about the unit. So take a phoneme. A phoneme can be described based on its positive properties and also the properties which contrasts it with other phonemes. And this is true of any unit. So in this sense, I think what Peirce had in mind was that people are signs that contrast with other signs. And then my favorite quote on this is, as the fact that every thought is a sign taken in conjunction with the fact that life is a train of thought proves that man is a sign. So each one of us is ourselves a sign. So that every thought is an external sign proves that man is an external sign. That is to say, the man and the external sign are identical in the same sense in which the words homo and man are identical. Thus, my language is the sum total of myself, for the man is the thought. And as I was rereading this in preparation for today's talk, I thought of my own conclusion in the book that I wrote a couple of years ago, Dark Matter of the Mind, in which I conclude with, thus we have seen that we learn things by the experiences we have from the womb to the coffin. Some of our learning begins as conscious engagement with etic experiences, eventually disappearing into the dark matter of our minds via emicization, building an insider perspective of a whole from outsider perspectives of its parts. By interpreting our experiences, by building a set of etic memories into an emically constructed whole, and I should say this is all a semiotic process of understanding the signs and interpreting the signs of our lives, a gestalt being we create ourselves. As Buddhism understands us to be the sum total of our thoughts, so we have arrived via our long circuitous path through philosophy, visual perception, culture, linguistics, translation, and hermeneutics. That word's misspelled there, unfortunately. Probably is in the book too. At the understanding that our mental and social experiences lead to our emergent selves, and that this vision is ill-served by the proposal of mysterious, genetically hardwired knowledge that only obscures and hinders our study of the individual and culture. Thus, we must move beyond instincts and beyond human nature if we are to understand how our social lives and individual bodies work together to build our roles, understandings, values, knowledge, structures, conventions, norms, and our very place in the world. So, although I didn't say it at the time, this is largely a semiotic conclusion that I think is quite compatible with Peirce's own view of human beings as signs. But why give a lecture on signs? Don't linguists already know about signs? I mean, we hear about signs throughout our linguistic careers, but the answer is no. Most linguists use terms like symbol, icon, index, and sign very loosely. We hear, for example, terms like sound symbolism, although this term is most often used, it would be better called sound iconicity. Symbol is a fairly technical notion, and it's not just a synonym for sign. We hear about cave paintings in the prehistoric world being symbolic, when in fact, we don't know if they're symbolic, but we do know that they're iconic. We hear about animals using symbols, while in every case that I've ever investigated, animal communication is the use of icons and indexes, and the same for plant communication. I've been really interested in recent years, or actually not recent years, but recent months, in the work on plant cognition, plant memory, plant communication, plant use of signs. And there's a literature on this by some very interesting scientists. We hear that the real jump cognitively from communication to language is syntax, when in fact syntax is found throughout nature, as I point out in my book, How Language Began. But symbol use is found almost exclusively among humans. When most linguists think or talk about signs, they mean Saussurean signs, which were a much less theoretically developed form of semiotics or semiology from Persian signs. Peirce called the field semiotics, Saussure tend to call it semiology. I think the difference is reflected in the fact that Peirce, but not Saussure, was a mathematician and a scientist. He made his living, Peirce did, for 32 years as a geophysicist for the US government. Um, Signs go way back. One of the first authors to write in detail and impressively, even from a modern perspective, about signs was Sextus Empiricus, who wrote in the second and third century. Well, he wrote in the third century AD, versus the Stoics, which wrote in the third century BCE. I guess AD should say ACE. It will be well to first of all consider what grammatic or the art of grammar is, and whether a systematic and real art or science can be conceived on the lines of the conception put forward by the grammarians. This comes from Empiricus's book Against the Professors, 150, paragraph 57. If nouns exist by nature and are not significant in each instance by reason of convention, then all men ought to understand the speech of all. This is an interesting comment by Sextus Empiricus, which summarizes also the distinction between Plato and Aristotle on the origin of words. For Plato, words were natural. They reflected they were the natural representation of what they meant. And for Aristotle, and I discussed this in length in Dark Matter of the Mind, for Aristotle, the origin of meanings of words was conventional. Society determined what words meant and what form they took. So Empiricus clearly falls on the side of Aristotle here, and against Plato, and makes the relevant observation that is, if all words had a natural or biological origin as opposed to conventional or cultural origin, then everybody ought to speak the same language. And clearly we do not. He also makes it clear that animals follow signs. The dog, when he tracks a beast by its footprints, is interpreting by signs, but he does not therefore derive an impression of the judgment if this is a footprint, a beast is here. The sign is not a judgment, which is the antecedent of a major premise. And this is very important. Both Sextus Empiricus and the Stoics recognize the differences between icons and indexes. Neither one of them quite arrived at the understanding of a symbol, but Sextus Empiricus came the closest. But he's absolutely correct here that when an animal interprets a sign, this does not involve conscious inferences. There is inference going on, but it is not conscious in this sense. Another pioneer in the theory of signs, who's often overlooked, is the Portuguese scholar João Poinçot, John Poinçot, John of St. Thomas. He studied at the University of Coimbra, Universidade de Coimbra, from 1589 to 1644. And he published one of the most significant books in the history of semiotics, Tractatus de Signis, in 1632. Thomas Sebeok, the late Thomas Sebeok, who was a leading semiotician in the United States, pointed out that Poinçot belongs decisively to that mainstream as the missing link between the ancients, such as Sextus Empiricus and the Stoics, and the moderns in the history of semiotic, a pivot as well as a divide between the two huge intellective landscapes, the ancient and medieval one that stretches from Aristotle and the pre-Socratics to the time of Galileo and Descartes, and the modern landscape from that time to Einstein, Wittgenstein, and Husserl and our own, the ecology of neither of which could be fully appreciated without the other. I neglected to add to this, here's a picture of the most recent edition of the Tractatus de Signis, translated by John Deely, and arranged by John Deely with some excellent introductions. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I strongly recommend this book. And another name that I inadvertently forgot to include here is John Locke. John Locke was one of the, in the English-speaking world, was the first one to write in detail about signs and semiotics, and what he has to say is consistent with largely with what has followed and very pioneering. Everybody is a semiotician. A doctor certainly has to be a semiotician. A doctor is an expert, among other things, in the interpretation of signs, which they call symptoms, and which diseases they represent. So in Persian terms, a symptom is the physical form or sign of an object, which is the disease, and it is interpreted by the doctor. Thus, when we say treat the causes, not the symptoms, in common usage, symptoms just means signs. So don't treat the signs of the disease, treat the disease itself. All creatures and all plants, and some have argued even minerals, interpret signs, leading to the field of biosemiosis. So this quote comes from a new book on plant communication called, and the quote is, "Plant cognition, or plant nosophysiology, is the study of the mental capacities of plants." This is perfectly consistent with Peirce's idea that the entire universe is a mind. Mind is that all matter is effete mind. This is similar to Einstein's idea that all matter is a form of energy. But all matter for Peirce was a form of mind, and so mind permeates the universe. This doesn't mean that he overlooked the concept of a human mind and what human cognition is. But in this book, it explores the idea that plants are capable of responding to and learning from stimuli in their surroundings in order to choose and make decisions that are most appropriate to ensure survival. Over recent years, experimental evidence for the cognitive nature of plants has grown rapidly and has revealed the extent to which plants can use senses and cognition to respond to their environments. Some research claims that plants have physical structures functioning in the same way as the nervous systems of animals. And if you just Google plant cognition or plant communication, you'll find a lot on this. There's also a popular level book, which I find very interesting, The Hidden Life of Forests, I think it is. I should remember the title, but which talks about the forest as a living creature. And we find this in anthropology too, in which when we study any group, we must include the ecology as one of the characters in the culture that we're studying. So let's talk a little bit about Charles Sanders Peirce. He was born Charles Sanders Peirce, but added the name Santiago to his name later on, Charles Sanders Santiago Peirce. He didn't do this legally, so not required to say Santiago. As I've gone back through some of the documents, I noticed a replica of when Peirce visited the British Museum's reading room in London in the 19th century. He signed on one of his 4 or 5 trips to Europe. He signed it as Charles Sanders Sandero Peirce. Sandero means laborer, worker. He changed that to Santiago, and some people have suggested that this was to honor his lifelong friend and benefactor, William James. James is Tiago in Portuguese, for example, Santiago. Anyway, this is only interesting if you're interested in the life of Peirce, but I'm going to give a little bit of very small background into that. Peirce was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1839. And as I said, he was raised on the campus. He was basically raised on Harvard Yard. He died in Milford, Pennsylvania in 1914, so he lived to be 74, almost 75. His students, he didn't have many students because he didn't teach that long, but his students include at least 3 of the greatest names in U.S. intellectual history. Josiah Royce, who went on to become a philosopher at Harvard. Josiah Royce's PhD student was C.I. Lewis. C.I. Lewis's PhD student was Willard Van Orman Quine, one of them, and Quine's PhD students included Donald Davidson and many others. Christine Ladd Franklin did her PhD with Peirce. These were all students of his at the Johns Hopkins University, which is the only place that he held teaching post. And he only held that for about 5 years. Christine was the first woman to receive a PhD in math and logic, although Johns Hopkins withheld the degree from her for roughly 40 years because she was a woman and they didn't consider it appropriate for a woman to have a PhD, but they did eventually give her the PhD. And John Dewey, who went on to become one of the most famous American philosophers. It was Peirce's only academic job. He was fired because a trustee of the Johns Hopkins University, which was brand new. He was one of the first professors, he was among the first crop of professors hired, saw him emerging from a hotel with a woman who wasn't his wife, and therefore he was fired and never hired again. He lived out the rest of his life in poverty. He did marry that woman, and they were married for over 30 years. He lived in poverty after this. He died in obscurity. Harvard purchased his papers. They treated his papers badly for decades, but now Harvard has them cataloged and available for viewing, and I spend, when we're not suffering from the pandemic, so up until March of last year, I spent 2 days a week at the Harvard Library copying Peirce's papers. Chomsky said in an interview in 1976, Conversations with Mitsuo Hona, in relation to the question we have been discussing, the philosopher to whom I feel closest and whom I'm almost paraphrasing is Charles Sanders Peirce. So Peirce had a big influence on Chomsky, especially as we'll see in a future lecture in his discussion of what Peirce called the guessing instinct or abduction. The only caveat I offer is that, so far as I can tell from Chomsky's writings, he never really understood much about Peirce's thought, and this was a throwaway line. Here's the home that Peirce was born in. It still stands there in Cambridge, Massachusetts today. I've toured the home. It's now a set of offices for Lesley University in Cambridge. And this is me in front of the home that Peirce lived in for a couple of decades and died in. He died roughly where this window is that my pointer is pointing at. But this was his house. He named it Eresby because in ancient Greek, Eresby was a crossroads. And this is in the Pocono Mountains, and he intended this to be a place of retreat for New Yorkers and others who were interested in having a cafe society along the lines of France, but he wanted that to be in his home. His dreams were never realized. He didn't communicate well with the average person, and many people found him to be not only difficult to understand, but quite cantankerous. His parents, Benjamin Peirce, as I've said, was one of the greatest mathematicians in US history, considered not only the best mathematician in the United States during his lifetime, but also the US's leading scientist. He helped found the National Academy of Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. One of the co-founders with Benjamin Peirce of the National Academy of Sciences was Abraham Lincoln, to give you an idea of the time frame. On the right is Peirce's mother, Sarah, whose relatives included senators and very many well-to-do people in New England. Peirce, on the far left, you have Peirce as a student at Harvard. He graduated in 1859, and then 2 years later took a summa cum laude degree in chemistry from Harvard, the first summa cum laude degree in chemistry ever awarded. In the middle, we see Peirce traveling through Europe as a young man, and on the right, Peirce as an older man, and when he was living at Eresby. The contemporaries of Peirce, to give an idea of when this happened, were J.D. Rockefeller, founder of Standard Oil, which is today Exxon Mobil and all sorts of other oil companies. Andrew Carnegie, of the Carnegie Institute, Carnegie Mellon University, Carnegie Foundation, Mark Twain, General George Armstrong Custer, who was almost exactly the same age as Peirce and killed in 1876 in Little Bighorn. Renoir, Van Gogh, Ferdinand de Saussure was very close to Peirce in age. Gottlob Frege was also a contemporary of Peirce. A partial list of Peirce's accomplishments include the importance and range of his contributions to science, mathematics, and philosophy. He was the first to, well, he, along with Gottlob Frege, the development of mathematical logic, the development of semiotics, the philosophical school of pragmatism, which often is given, William James is giving credit for that, but that's Peirce's term and his development. The modern development of phenomenology, which Peirce developed arguably better and earlier than Edmund Husserl, and the invention of universal grammar with the property of recursion, before and, in my opinion, better than Chomsky's. Although for Peirce, universal grammar was the set of constraints on signs, and syntax played a lesser role. We'll see what he meant by recursion. He didn't mean syntactic recursion per se. Other accomplishments of Peirce include the first to discover the shape of the Milky Way galaxy, the first to precisely measure the Earth's gravity and circumference, one of the most accurate and versatile projections of the 3D globe on the Earth, of the Earth onto a 2D space, called his quincuncial projection, the chemistry of relations and working out the consequences of the discovery of the electron for the periodic table, the axiomization of the law of the excluded middle, called Peirce's law, existential graphs and the transformation of mathematics thereby into a quasi-empirical component of studies on cognition, one of the first studies on the stellar spectra, particularly the spectral properties of argon, the invention of the then most accurate gravimetric pendulum. The first standardization of the length of the meter was done by Peirce by anchoring it to the length of a wavelength of light, which he figured out via his own experiments in multiple stations around Europe and North America. This is far from an exhaustive list. So we want to start off, any study of Peirce's semiotics has to include this in a study of his phaneroscopy or phenomenology. Peirce's phenomenology can be broken down into three sections, three components, which are named firstness, secondness, and thirdness. Within his larger philosophical system, Peirce's semiotics derives from his phenomenology. By the way, this all is going to lead back into linguistics and the theories of linguistics, but we really need a foundation in semiotics before we can move on there. Thus, this entire class is a detour on the life and work of Peirce. It won't be the last. He was the first to develop a philosophical theory of phenomenology, which he called phaneroscopy, from the Greek word phaneros, which means what is visible or manifest. Husserl developed his own theory of phenomenology and ironically became better known for this than Peirce did. Peirce's theory of pragmatics comes from a statement, developed far beyond the statement, but the original statement of pragmatics or American pragmatism, which is arguably the only unique contribution of America to philosophy, of a philosophical school, is consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. So you've defined an object, let's say a rock, in a certain way. What are the consequences of this definition that you've given to this rock? It's hard, it's round, it's subject to the laws of gravity and this sort of thing. Then that's all you could possibly mean by rock. You couldn't mean anything else by it other than what its consequences are. You have to be able to put concepts to use or they don't exist. This comes from Peirce's famous, one of his most important articles, How to Make Our Ideas Clear. So for Peirce, who introduced phaneroscopy formally in 1905, humans know all things in one of three ways: by firstness, secondness, or thirdness. Roughly speaking, firstness is, and this turns out to be vital for the understanding of Peirce's signs. Firstness is an initial impression, such as I see something red. I'm not quite sure what it is, seems red to me. It's like something let's say we see in the distance or hear very dimly, and we have some sort of initial impression. That's firstness. Um, Peirce also invented the terms type and token, along with the term tone. So if I see something when I'm not quite sure what it is, I have a tone. I've seen a tone of redness. Um, an icon, an image, or something that corresponds to something is a sign of firstness. It's a rough impression. Secondness is a clearer perception of the distinctive feature of the object based on contrast or comparison with another perceptual experience, what Peirce referred to as a resistance of one object to another. So, as in my hand pressing on a weight, or red versus green in thought, or perceived in succession. There's some opposition that I'm mentally or physically imposing between two objects, which produces a secondness or a token. An index is a sign of secondness. So the fact that I have my eyes stimulated by a red thing is an experience of firstness. But in comparing a red thing to other things, its individual identity becomes clearer. When I understand something well enough to generalize about it, my knowledge is at the level of thirdness. Signs of thirdness are symbols. Thus, Peirce successfully derives his entire semiotics from his phenomenology, something that no other theory of signs has ever done, merely stipulating the nature of signs. So again, the crucial terms are type, token, and tone. All symbols are types. Individual instances are tokens, and tones are individual impressions. So let's think about how you could apply this in something that all or many linguists have to do, which is analyze the sounds of a particular language, beginning segmental phonological analysis, or what I prefer to call phonemics. There's a link here to an article that I wrote on Charles Sanders Peirce for Eon magazine. It gives a brief introduction, repeating, and that some of the material here is taken from that article. So firstness, secondness, and thirdness are crucial to all science. In linguistics, for example, the analysis of sound systems requires each of these ways of seeing. First, a sound is perceived for some of its physical characteristics as a tone. Only by opposing this sound to other sounds, however, can we begin to see more clearly the sound. Linguists would say that this is how one figures out the sound systems of understudied languages. It's how I did, for example, my first day of field research among the Pitaha, how I do monolingual field research in general. We perceive a sound that could be a P, let's say. I hear, this could be a voiceless bilabial occlusive. I'm not sure, but that's what it sounded like to me. So that's a tone. I'm hearing the tone of that sound, its firstness. And then I start to compare this P to a T and then to a B, and I start to get a better idea that this is a token of a voiceless bilabial occlusive. And eventually I narrowed down my perception of this sound by comparing it to other sounds, and learning by this comparison or resistance that the sound was made either with the tongue, T, or the lips, P and B, or with the vocal cords vibrating, B, or not, T and P. From the initial firstness of our impression of the sound P, we can, by secondness, view or understand it with clearer resolution, and we get a token of the sound. So we actually have this as a P. We don't know what type it belongs to. So a type of sound is a phoneme, and its tokens are its individual manifestations, which include all of its allophones. From the initial firstness of our impression, we view it with clearer resolution. However, once we have further identified Via resistance, the sound P, linguists will want to know how it fits into different systems of sounds. What is its type? What is the role of P in Spanish or Portuguese or English? The answer will vary. This systematization of knowledge provides the perspective of thirdness on the objects. And so now we have reached a type. So we know that P is a phoneme. That's its type. It is the type P phoneme because we have gone from the general first impression or tone to the token by comparison with other sounds. And now we have compared it. Pike had something similar, and he talked about the analysis of sounds or any linguistic units as particle, wave, and field. Particle would be more or less corresponding to the impression, although these don't map isomorphically. Pike's terms are not the same as Peirce's, and they can't be reduced to Peirce's terms, but there's some similarity there. Now, this will be familiar to most linguists. This is Saussurean dyadic semiotics. Saussure proposed this simple distinction. So, if you take the word tree, for Saussure, it has a form, tree, the phonemes, T-R-E, long E, and it has the meaning of whatever tree means. That's a sign. This turned out to be, important for Saussure, and many people today, when they talk about semiotics or semiology, they only have Saussurean semiotics in mind. But this is a very, in my opinion, underdeveloped theory of semiotics, and I don't spend any further time on it. Peircean triadic semiotics is quite different. So every Peircean sign has at least three components. The object, what in the universe of discourse, fact or fiction, does the sign reference? So it doesn't matter whether unicorns exist or don't exist. They're both they're objects within the universe of discourse when we're talking about unicorns or tree. An interpretant, what sign is used to determine the meaning of the current sign? So for Peirce, and this is where recursion comes in, every sign must be interpreted by another sign. And this then goes on. It's a form of semiotic or logical, even cognitive recursion, although we don't take it back all the way cognitively, it would go that way logically. There is a way to break the infinite regress of interpreting recursion in some work that Peirce did on indexes, but I won't bother you with that here. The representamen is the physical form of the sign referencing the object in some uses. So we'll use those three terms, object, interpretant, representamen. The object and representamen, as I've defined them here, correspond to Saussure's form and meaning, but the interpretant, which turns out to be very important in Peirce's theory, doesn't have an explicit counterpart in Saussure. I mean, obviously Saussure knew that we had to interpret signs, but he doesn't build the theoretical logical component of interpretant into his theory of signs. So take the symbol tree. The object refers to a type, a generic or universal, and is thus a third. This is something interesting about symbols, which doesn't apply to other kinds of signs that we're going to see. A symbol always has a type, a general object as its object. So the word tree, the symbol tree, doesn't refer to any particular tree. It refers to trees. And we can make it refer to specific trees using indexes. But the thing about a symbol is that it refers to a general object. So the object will have a token that is concrete. The object in general is a type, but the types have tokens. So the tree seen as we talk about it, for example, is the token of the tree meaning of the symbol. So its object is a generality, not a specific. So the representamen, Peirce sometimes uses the term sign, but that's a sign of a sign that gets a bit confusing, so I'll avoid that. is the phonetic form tree. Here it could be a picture, it could be any number of things. The interpretant means simply to understand tree, we must have an interpretant, as all symbols must, which is another sign. And propositions and arguments can also be signs. So here is the sign, one sign to interpret tree. A tree is a woody plant having one erect perennial stem trunk at least 3 inches in diameter at a point 4.5 feet above the ground, a definitely formed crown of foliage, and a mature height of at least 13 feet. That's the definition of a tree given by the U.S. Forestry Department. So that whole sentence is a sign that interprets the sign tree. And if you ask me, how do you interpret the sentence, then you need more signs. So we interpret every sign in terms of other signs. Therefore, interpretants are recursive in the sense that every interpretant must have an interpretant. Sign 1 is interpreted by sign 2, which is interpreted by sign 3, which, and on and on. We break an infinite regress via an index according to Peirce. The purpose of Peirce's semiotics is to construct a naturalistic but non-reductive account of the human mind, to explain and defend the claim that the sciences are objective in their mode of inquiry and in fact yield knowledge of an independently existing reality. The mature semiotic was developed in an attempt to explain on a naturalistic basis what we now call the intentionality of mind. These quotes come from probably the best book ever written on Peirce's theory of signs by T.L. Short, Cambridge University Press, Peirce's theory of signs. So back in the 19th century until 1914, as Peirce worked on this, he was doing cognitive science. And again, as I said last class, Peirce is the first experimental psychologist in the United States and the second in the world. According to the Peircean theory of semiotics, signs are divisible by 3 trichotomies. First, according as the sign itself is a mere quality, is an actual existent, or is a general law. Secondly, according to the relation of the sign to its object, whether it consists in the signs having some character in itself or in some existential relation to that object, or in its relation to an interpretant. Thirdly, according as its interpretant represents it as a sign of possibility, a sign of fact, or a sign of reason. If this sounds complicated, it is complicated. So what are some examples? Well, the initial classification of signs, we'll get signs of a couple of different types. So a quali-sign, what Peirce called a quali-sign, is something that represents a quality, such as redness. That's the sign. The relationship, that's the relationship of the sign to signs. So it's the type of sign, it represents a quality. Relative to the object, the sign, the quality sign can be called an icon. And it has characters in itself. So if you see a footprint, that can be an icon. It can be an index of the entire individual, but it can also be an icon of someone's foot. It looks like their foot. And the way that we do this is that we can draw correspondences between the footprint and the actual foot that made the footprint. So an icon is about correspondences. We see the same thing in syntactic trees. If you design a tree or draw a tree of a sentence, you have created an icon of that sentence. Not a picture of the sentence, but a corresponding, an icon that has corresponding parts that relate to parts of the sentence. A photograph is also an icon. A reflection in a mirror is an icon. A television image is an icon. So my dog watching television shows, I have 3 dogs. 2 of them never pay any attention to the TV, or only very rarely. 1 pays a lot of attention to the TV, but only when other animals are there, and especially when other dogs are on the TV screen. And this is whether they're barking or simply being silent on the TV screen. So this shows that the dog is able to recognize icons. All animals can recognize icons or they wouldn't survive. And we're animals, so we have to do it too. The interpretant of a first, a quasi-sign, icon, or possibility, these are all firsts, um, shows something as a possibility. So maybe that's redness. Sin sign is something which is existent. Um, so quasi-sign might be redness. A sin sign would be an object that is red. An index is a second type of, is a symbol of secondness in which we indicate an object. So footprint, we said it could be an icon of a foot. It can also be an index of a person. By seeing the footprint, I don't care that it looks like their foot because I don't know what their foot actually looks like because I don't know which person made it. But I do know that a person or an animal had to make that footprint and they had to be here some time ago. And I can tell by the freshness of the footprint how recently they were there. And so that's an index. It's an existential relation. And that corresponds the interpretation to the interpretation of a fact. Legisign is a general law, and it relates the object. The legisign that refers to objects is a symbol that refers to general objects, and the interpretant that most corresponds to legisigns is reason. Now let's give some examples. So quasi-sign would be a general impression of redness. A sin sign, which means that we have a sign of something that actually exists, could be a red ball. Legisign is red for all red things. So that's a general term that we've learned. An icon can be a picture or a photograph. It just means that there are parts within the icon that correspond to parts of the object. So the picture is not the object, but it looks like it. And when we say that the picture or the photograph looks like the object, what we mean by that is that the parts correspond in an obvious way. The more obvious, the more clear the likeness. An index could be a footprint or a smell or smoke. It signifies an existential relation between that sign, the index, and the thing that made the sign. It was physically caused by that thing. And a symbol, it refers to a general kind of interpretation, a general kind of object. So the skull and crossbones, literally, those are icons of a skull, a human skull, and human femur, usually, I guess. But in their symbolic state, they simply represent death or pirates or something like that. So they take on a non-indexical, non-iconic meaning, and they refer to a generality, and therefore they become a symbol. In terms of interpretation, the interpretation of a quasi-sign redness is a sort of possibility. It seems like redness. Not quite sure if it is, but it seems like it. Fact, that is a red thing. That corresponds to a sin sign, to an index, and reason. A skull and crossbones is a conventional symbol representing the generality of death. That is why it is a symbol, because of this conventionality. There are different types of signs. There are terms, for example, which correspond to words in the linguistic system, sentences, and arguments. A term, a word, noun, or verb represents possibilities. They refer to general types, and the possibilities are instantiation by tokens. Sentences represent facts, and arguments represent reason. So let's look at a term like see. Peirce would have drawn the term, he would have indicated the term see with two blanks, one on each side. This indicates the number of arguments or number of places or terms that have to complete the verb see. Peirce called this valency, and linguists use this term widely today, probably not knowing that it comes from Peirce. So he would have said that see has a valency of 2, and he introduced the term valency based on his study of chemistry and his work on the periodic table of elements. Give has a valency of 3. John gave Bill the book. John gave the book to Bill. Now, one interesting fact, and we'll see if we have time to talk about this during the course, is that linguists know that no verb has a basic valency greater than 3. We've never found a language that has basic valency greater than 3. There always has to be some sort of modification to get 4, or some marked situation. And Peirce derives this logically. And so for him, this has nothing to do with biology. The limitation of valency to 3 is a logical fact. Another term would be Ball, which is a subject. Peirce called objects and subjects what we call objects and subjects. He called them both subjects. And a term like ball is used to plug the valency in another term, such as see the ball. A sentence, let's take the big boy saw the little boy. The big boy, and this is a little more complicated. A sentence is a symbol which breaks down into an icon and an index. So the big boy is an index. That's what we're talking about. So we're pointing to that big boy over there, and we're telling something about that big boy. So the subject is the index, and saw the little boy as the icon. It creates a picture of what the thing referred to by the index did. And the entire sentence is a symbol. Symbols very often break down into combinations of icons and indexes. Arguments are syllogisms for induction, deduction, induction, and abduction. We'll talk about this in a future lesson in more detail, but we will talk about it a bit today because it's important to know that these are arguments. So let me try to summarize. This actually comes from Wikipedia, so you can look this up on Wikipedia and see this, but it's well laid out. A sign, always immediate to itself, even if it's not immediate or to a mind. So a sign is what we've already said it is. It is composed of 3 things, but it can also be used to refer to the representamen or the physical form. An object, now here is a little different for Peirce. There can be an immediate object, the object is represented in the sign, or there can be the dynamic object, the object as it really is. So if I say, this gets a little bit back into Kant's philosophy about perceiving things as they really are, or not. So I can say, that's a yellow car. So the immediate object of my sign is that's a yellow car. But it turns out, let's say that the light is bad, and when we get closer up to it, it's actually an orange car. So the color that I had referred to immediately as yellow turns out, upon closer inspection, to be orange. So immediate object is the object, however we refer to it using the sign, but the dynamic object is more abstract. It is what the immediate object is founded on, what the object is in itself, the dynamoid object, the dynamical object, but we'll refer to it as the dynamic object. The interpretant, there are 3 types of interpretants. So this gets more, you can see how it's much more complex than, say, Saussurean semiotics. The immediate interpretant is the quality of the impression which a sign is fit to produce, not any actual relation in which sign carries with it even before there's an interpreter. So the immediate interpretant of red is just this impression that we are labeling redness. And that impression, that thing that is redness, would be there whether we saw it or not. It is the sound made in the forest when nobody's around. So yes, they would make a sound, but that's the immediate interpretant. The dynamic interpretant is the actual effect of the sign on a mind or a quasi-mind. A quasi-mind is anything that's not a human mind, because remember, for Peirce, everything is mind. For instance, the agitation of the feeling. In Searle's speech act theory, we could think of dynamic interpretant as the perlocutionary effect of a sign. So we have the illocutionary effect and the perlocutionary effect. So the dynamic interpretant is whatever that sign does to me. I hear you say, shut up. That produces a reaction in me. That's the dynamic interpretant. The final interpretant is the effect which the sign would have on the conduct of any mind or quasi-mind if circumstances allowed that effect to be fully achieved. That is the sign's ultimate end or purpose. The final interpretant of one's inquiry about the weather is the inquiry's purpose, the effect which the response would have on the plans for a day of anyone anybody in one's shoes. The final interpretant of a line of investigation as such is the truth as the ideal final opinion. So if you tell me what gravity is, that could just be the fact, you see a book fall to the ground, you say, well, that's gravity. That would be the immediate interpretant. The dynamic interpretant is what me seeing that book fall to the ground actually creates within me. The final interpretant, however, is based on the ultimate understanding of gravity, whatever gravity turns out to be. And that also is similar to the dynamic object. So Peirce would call these things, the final interpretant is always the truth. But he doesn't think that we will necessarily ever reach the truth. He doesn't deny the existence of truth, as William James seemed to at many times. I think William James did deny the idea of ultimate truth. Peirce did not. He simply said that it's something we can only discover at the end of all inquiry on the matter. So here are Peirce's categories again, just go over these briefly. So firstness, secondness, and thirdness. Firstness is a quality of feeling. It has to do with ideas, chance, possibility. There's some vagueness to it. It's reference to some general property, but it's an abstraction. We haven't nailed it down. It's the quale, which is another Peircean term. It's the basic Peirce impression that we have. Secondness is reaction or resistance. It's like picking up a weight and trying to lift it. It is comparing two things. It's debating. So secondness leads to brute facts, actual things. It leads to this discreteness. I'm pointing out a specific thing. It refers to a correlate of something, and it essentially is dyadic. So if I point at something, that's an index, that's a sign of secondness, and there are two things involved, the pointing and the thing pointed at. Eventually there will be an interpretation, but when I just point at something, as an animal, let's say, or in a bee's dance, giving the direction of the source of honey, this doesn't require mental interpretation. This is just a dyadic relationship. The bee just flies out in the direction indicated by the dancing bee. Thirdness is representation or mediation. This is found in habits and laws and necessity, and is often referred to by generality, continuity, by quantifiers like all. It is reference to an interpretant. It requires a generality, a type of interpretation, and it's triadic. So it's when we get the thirdness or symbols that we get to the full triadic semiotics. A rime for Peirce, which is often equivalent to a term which we've talked about, is a sign that represents its object in respect of quality. It's a character or mark. It may be an icon, index, or symbol, or such as a simple word. A proposition, for example, with the subject places left blank, that would be like C. Remember, Peirce calls both the object and the subject. So C with a blank before it and after it is a rime. It has to be filled in. It's only a potential type of meaning. Subject terms, the noun by itself is also a rime. It also needs to be joined to something to be completed. A proposition can be considered a zero-place rime, a zero-place predicate. If you've got a full proposition, there's nothing left to plug into it. So it's still a rime, but it's a completed rime. There's nothing else to add. A disi sign is a sign that represents its object in respect of actual existence. Another way to think about the disi sign is as a predicate. It's intended to have some compulsive effect on the interpreter. So for Peirce, if I say the weather is blowing west, that's a disi sign, it's a proposition. But also if I see a weathercock that has been pointed west by the wind, That's also a Dissy sign. It's interpreted like a proposition. So propositions don't have to correspond to sentences. They don't even have to correspond to human language. We can see propositions expressed in forms of nature around us. Um, a proposition in the conventional sense is a dissonant symbol, a Dissy sign. An argument is a sign that represents its object in respect of a law or habit, and so in its signified interpretant is represented as symbolic. And this is, I'm going to leave available to you on the slides. What this particular slide shows is that is a lot of complicated realization. So an icon can be a symbol as well. I mean, it's not a symbol as well, but you can have an icon functioning as a legisign or an index. So let me give you an example of an index. If I point at something, that's an index. But there are conventions on pointing, so that pointing in a certain way in American culture means one thing or another. And this means that the index has been turned into a type of legisign. So indexes can be, you can have an indexical legisign, for example, which is an index which is controlled by general laws of the culture. So a footprint is an index whether there's any culture around or not. A dog can interpret a footprint or a smell and requires no culture. But once we begin to generalize, and once we take on conventional meanings of indexes and icons, so the skull and crossbones is an icon of a skull and crossbones, but it now has been, by this line right here, it has been made into a legisign and a type of symbol of death. So the fact that something's an icon or an index doesn't mean that it can't be transformed into an iconical legisign or an indexical legisign or a rhematic symbol. We will see if there's opportunity as the class progresses to talk about these in more detail. These are very complicated things. Peirce spent a lot of his life working on this. And what I should say is that we can get by just fine for most things we're going to be talking about simply with this middle row of index, of icon, index, and symbol. All the others are important, and if we were developing a full theory of semiotic analysis of a language, we would use all these terms. But for most of our discussion purposes, we can get by just with index, icon, index, and symbol. Peirce from this derives 10 classes of signs. I won't go through all that. But what I do want to talk about a little bit are arguments, because for Peirce, this was very important. Peirce argued at length against Descartes. And for him, Descartes was in error on a number of things. First of all, he opposed Descartes' rationalism, and he opposed Descartes' concept of intuition and introspection. Peirce argued that the only way we can know anything about ourselves, about our grammatical judgments, or about anything else is not from some special power we have called intuition, but by inference. Inference has three forms: deduction, induction, and abduction. That's the only way we know about the world around us. All forms of reasoning have a rule, a case, and a result, a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. These are necessary to complete the sign of an argument, which he called the perfect sign, perfect symbol. So let's look at a deduction. Whenever it rains, a deep puddle of water collects at the corner of Ross Road. This is a rule. This is something we know. This always happens. It has been raining. That's the specific case. That's the instance. That's the data. So the first one is the general rule. The second one is the specific data. Then from that, we can deduce a premise. There will be a deep puddle of water down at the corner of Ross Road. That is the result. That's a deduction. If the premises are correct, the deduction must be. If the premises are true, the conclusion or the result must be true. So if it's true that whenever it rains, a deep puddle of water collects at the corner of Ross Road, and it's true that it has been raining, then it must be true that there will be a deep puddle of water down at the corner of Ross Road. There's no other way around. That's a deduction. It admits of no error. Uh, if there is an error, then the argument is false. But if these things are true, the argument is automatic. Induction puts the result first, the case second, and the rule third. So let's look again. So for deduction, it's the rule first, the case second, and the result third. For induction, it's the result, case, and rule. So the result, I see there's a deep puddle of water down at the corner of Ross Road. I'm seeing that right now. It has been raining. That's the case. That's the general observation that goes along with this specific observation. Maybe every time it rains, a deep puddle of water collects at that corner. That's the rule. So an induction is a way to get from an individual observation and a general case to a rule, or not a general case, but a general observation. So we link the two things. It has been raining. I link that to the fact that there's a deep puddle of water. And from that, I infer, all of these are inferences, deduction, induction, abduction. But in induction, I infer that maybe every time it rains, a deep puddle of water collects at that corner. And this is how a lot of our linguistic works. So we do inductive work. If we have a strong theory, then we would use a lot of deduction in our work. There's danger in both deduction because the rule could be incorrect, in which case we're going to get bad results and we won't have an explanation for them. Induction could be incorrect. The other problem with induction is that it doesn't create new knowledge very, very faithfully, because as David Hume said, induction has the problem of we would have to go through every single case in the world, every imaginable case, to see if the generality follows. So right now I see there's a deep puddle of water down at the corner of Ross Road. And right now I see it's been raining. So I draw the conclusion every time it rains a deep puddle, but I don't know if every time it rains a deep puddle of water collects unless I observe every single time it rains. And that I cannot do. So an induction is an inference that is very imperfect. It follows, but there's no guarantee that the rule is true. Unlike deduction, we don't have a guarantee of truth with induction. Now we get into a more interesting type of inference, the one that Peirce is most famous for. He did not invent deduction or induction, but he did develop abduction. Before I talk about Peirce's concept of abduction, let me say that this term is used in modern philosophy to indicate inference to the best generalization. That is not what Peirce meant. It is derived from Peirce's meaning, but Peirce meant something else. He meant guessing. So abduction, we start with the result. Remember, we started with the result also in induction. The difference is in abduction, we go to the rule and then we derive the case. So there's a deep puddle of water at the corner of Ross Road. That could be explained by the principle that every time it rains, a deep puddle of water collects at that corner. So maybe it has been raining. So deduction puts, abduction puts the result, which is the third, before the first, which is the rule, which precedes the case, which is 2. A deduction puts the rule first, the case second, and the result third. And induction puts the case third, just like an abduction, but then it has the case second and the rule third. So these are ways that you can derive abduction from deduction and induction from abduction and so on. But Peirce spent a lot of time studying the formal grounds of inference and the formal reasoning of inference and related this to semiotics. I teach classes for business students at Bentley University on a regular basis and tell them no matter what you hear about how business executives reason, there are only 3 forms of inference: abduction, deduction, induction. Everybody has to reason that way. That's the only way we get our facts, unless we believe in instinct or divine revelation. Other than that, we only get it through inference. Bad reasoning, which you see occasionally in papers, that you see the rule, the major premise, and then the conclusion without any case. So to give one example, I'm not blaming any particular theory, this is just the best known theory. Let's say that you believe the rule, all phrases are formed by merge, and two, you then claim that all phrases in this language are formed by merge, but you have no data necessarily to indicate that. So that's bad reasoning. It's not just, could turn out to be right. You just got the answer the wrong way. So just to sum up some of this, words, sentences, and discourses are all forms of signs. There are other kinds of things that are signs that we might not think of. So in Pitaha phonetics, women have one phoneme less than men. So where men have S and H, two separate sounds, females tend to use only H. This is not always done. Sometimes they use S, but almost always they use H. And so using H in the place of S is itself a sign of female speech or gay speech, because I do know one gay man who in Pitaha who uses female speech. Women have a more constricted pharyngeal wall when they talk. They sound more guttural when they speak. And this is also a sign, an index of female speech. It's also an icon, however, of female size, because females are smaller than males, not much in Pitaha culture, but they're smaller than males. And they use in Pitaha a smaller articulatory space. They articulate their consonants and vowels in a smaller space with a constricted pharynx. And so this is also iconic, smallness to smallness of Pitaha. So female and male pronunciation are both indexical signs and iconic signs. In American English, it's relatively widely assumed that females use wider color vocabulary than males. And so the use of a color term such as fuchsia, which I would never utter except in a class, I couldn't even probably pick it out well, but which is not that uncommon among females. Just the use of that term not only means has as its object a particular color, but it also is indexical of the fact that it's being spoken by a female. So it's a sign of femaleness. Conversational styles can be indexes of your position in a hierarchy, your gender, your position in a family. So many different kinds of things can be signs. So if we think of a grammar of a language as actually a semiotic grammar of a language, and I'll talk more later about how that could be, then this opens up a wide range of possibilities. It includes everything we normally talk about grammar, but a great deal more as part of the cultural conditioning of the language. But remember, for Peirce, as for example, as also for Chomsky, grammars and signs are not merely cultural creations. They have severe external constraints. So for Peirce, semiotics is limited by logic, and that includes grammar. And to some degree, this would also be true of Chomsky's theory. As we start to incorporate some of this information, and I know they've covered a lot of information today, we're also going to start talking about other developments such as existential graphs or discourse representation theory, which simply indicates that the sentence should not be the start symbol of the grammar, that the grammar actually starts with the discourse, and sentences are simply constituents of discourses. And once we look at sentences that way, we start to get a more complete view of the grammar, and we actually come up with better analyses of sentence level phenomena. We'll also talk about discourse coherence as a form of semiotics. So one thing that discourse representation theory, as far as I can tell, and I've been corresponding with Hans Kamp quite a bit about this since he's just sent me some new stuff. So one thing that I have not found very well articulated in discourse representation theory is what Joe Grimes and Halliday and Hassan and Givon, Tom Givon, in his new book Coherence, talks about as discourse coherence. And then we also want to talk about syntax as a form of semiotics, syntactic strategies of semiosis. And so that is all that I had for you today. And I can't see my, oh, here I go. Now I can see my arrow. So thank you for those of you who watched this lecture, and you have my email. And you can contact me if you have questions about this lecture. We will be following the syllabus as posted on the Aberlin site, and I do hope to take your questions. I will be giving another lecture next week, and then I will not be giving a lecture for 2 weeks, but eventually I will cover the syllabus material, and if you can see it in person, that's fine. If you prefer to watch it on YouTube, that's also fine, or on the site of the course, which where they all be displayed. You can watch it there as well. And if you prefer not to watch them at all, let me know why. Say, you know, gosh, that didn't help me at all. That lecture was not anything I cared to hear about. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I will talk to you again next week.